Welcome to the 5th IWMF Global Education webinar, Why Clinical Trials Matter and How to Find the Right One for You. My name is Ron Turnaway. I was diagnosed with Waldenstrom's in 2006. I've participated in a clinical trial, and I wrote about clinical trials from the patient perspective in the October 2020 IWMF Torch newsletter. It's my pleasure today to introduce Neena Kennedy, who is the Clinical Trial Nurse Navigator at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. Today, Neena will share basic tools for identifying appropriate clinical trials. She will provide guidance regarding enrollment, and she will explain the supports available during your trial experience. After her talk, we will all enjoy a live question and answer session. So thank you very much for your participation, and over to you, Neena.
Thank you so much and welcome. I'm so happy to be able to spend this time with you today to discuss something that I think is so important for anyone with a blood cancer diagnosis or with a family member or friend that has a blood cancer diagnosis that you really want to help. And that is really discussing clinical trials, why they matter, and how to find the right one for you or for your loved one. So here are my objectives for today. I'd like to go over basics, Clinical Trials 101, understanding the basics of clinical trials. I'd like to talk a little bit in depth about myths about clinical trials. There are a lot of them floating out there, and I'd like to dispel some of them for you. And then super important, how to find clinical trials that are right for you or for your loved one, and how LLS, or the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, can help you locate clinical trials that might be right for you, because it is a treacherous landscape to navigate, and we want to be able to help you if we can with that daunting task. And then finally, what are some special considerations to think about when you're considering a clinical trial? It isn't something to be taken lightly, and there's a lot of things to be thinking about, so we want to make sure that we answer some of those questions as well. Okay, so back to the basics. What is a clinical trial? Cancer clinical trials are carefully controlled research studies. They're conducted by doctors, scientists, researchers, drug companies to either test a new cancer treatment or to test treatments that we've already been using in the past that may be approved to use. We might be using them in a different way. Maybe that's by adding a new drug, an additional drug to an already proven drug regimen. Or we might be studying an approved drug that's but now in a new disease. So perhaps something that's already FDA approved to use in one type of blood cancer, and now we're trying it in a different type of blood cancer. Trials are also used to compare some known treatments, so standard of care treatments, with new ones to compare them to find out which one works better, maybe which one is tolerated better, or it might be as simple as trying to explore how a new treatment affects a patient's quality of life. So it might be something simple as looking at drugs that are given intravenously or through an IV, where you need to go to a treatment center, versus a new regimen that's given as an oral pill that you can take at home from the comfort of your own home. So really kind of comparing those types of things, quality of life. The goals or aim of a cancer clinical trial would be to help people live longer, to help them live better through better quality of life, and ideally, of course, to cure the diseases that they have or put them into a remission for a very long time. Clinical trials are certainly crucial because that's really the only way that we have to know that a new treatment or an old treatment used in a different way really is more effective than the treatments that we're currently using or the treatments that we've been using in the past. Many patients today are living longer, they're living better, or they've been cured or in remission for a long time of their disease because of clinical trials. So what is the process? How does a drug get through the clinical trial process, or how does it get started? It's important to note that clinical trials are not drug discoveries. Discoveries are actually made pre-clinical trial in a lab setting, not in human testing. So lots of experiments in labs are going on all the time, and thousands of them never reach a clinical trial themselves because they just don't make sense to actually test in humans. It can take decades to get a new drug approved through the clinical trial process. It's not a quick a quick process in general. It takes sometimes us up to a decade. Drugs are initially studied in a laboratory setting long before humans. Once a researcher feels that they have a promising study, something that they feel that would be safe and effective to use in a specific disease, they submit an application to the FDA called an NDA, or New Drug Application. And the FDA scrutinizes that proposed clinical trial, or in some cases you can call it an experiment, and then either asks for more information from that researcher or approves the drug to be studied in a controlled clinical trial. Each cancer clinical trial has a written detailed study design that's called a protocol, or clinical trial protocol, and that includes several factors. It basically looks at why the clinical trial is needed. Is this a rare disease, perhaps, where new treatments are lacking, or we're just not seeing effective results in the current regimens that are being used? What is the purpose of a clinical trial? So is it to look at a new drug, a new combination of drugs? Is it a new, in some cases, medical device? And really going into a lot of detail as to the science behind what we're studying, how it works on the human body, the physiology very specifically. The protocol will go through a very, very detailed study calendar outlining the treatment schedule, basically when patients need to be seen, what the treatment schedule looks like. Is it every week? Is it every 3 weeks? Is it a daily pill that people take? How often do the patients need to come back to have lab work done? So how often are we looking at those lab results? Are there response assessments being done, such as bone marrow biopsies or scans, and how often are those done? And within all of these time points, there are generally windows. So for instance, you would maybe be seen every 7 days plus or minus 2 days. So that means that there's a very regimented schedule that patients would need to be expected to follow while on clinical trials. It's pretty regimented. We're also in the protocol going to see the safety measures throughout the clinical trial program. Clinical trials are obviously the utmost importance of safety. So we're really going to be looking at what kinds of side effects do we expect to see. All of that is again done pre-clinical trial and lab work, so that when a clinical trial is designed, researchers really have an idea of what types of side effects we're going to be expecting to see. And there are also going to be pretty good detail in that protocol on how to treat those side effects if they're seen, what types of supportive medications will be given or should be considered. We're also going to be looking at how to report those types of side effects for safety. So for example, there may be some serious side effects are seen, or maybe a patient is hospitalized. Those types of things need to be reported usually within a very specific time frame, within 24, 36 hours, to the clinical trial sponsor, so that there's an awareness that a serious side effect has been seen. So that, again, is outlined in great detail in the protocol. We're going to be looking at outcomes. So what are we expecting to see for this particular trial? Are we looking at efficacy, or how the disease that we're studying responds to these new medications? So outcomes are going to be very well outlined in the protocol. There's also going to be a lot of language around eligibility for the clinical trial. So what population are we studying? We need to look very specifically at inclusion and exclusion criteria for the trial. We might be looking at, of course, specific diseases, specific ages, health history. So if we know that we're studying a disease or a drug that could have an effect on the heart, we're certainly not going to, we're going to exclude patients that maybe have had a recent heart condition or heart attack. Those types of things are very well outlined in this eligibility or inclusion exclusion criteria. Let's see. The other thing, certainly we're going to look at how the clinical trial is organized. Is it going to be conducted only at one site where it is maybe a physician researcher that's looking at a small trial that's going to be run at only their particular clinical site? Or is it, a pharmaceutical company sponsoring a large multiple site study that's going to be conducted at multiple sites? And in which case, if that is the case where we have multiple sites where the clinical trial is being conducted, all the participating physicians and study teams need to follow the exact same protocol. So again, this is kind of like the protocol is kind of like the clinical trial Bible per se, where everyone, or operating manual, where everyone follows the exact same instructions while running the trial. Clinical trials are certainly regulated very closely by the FDA in the United States. And in other countries, there are similar agencies like the FDA that have similar oversight into trials running in their countries. Additionally, there is something called an IRB, or Institutional Review Board, that is made up of a group of individuals, some scientists, some physicians, but many of the IRB members are not involved in the research studies themselves. They might be lay people. They should always have a community or lay person on the IRB board that's not affiliated with the clinical site or the clinical trial or the sponsor at all, so that they have a very objective group of people that's really overseeing the trial site and the way it's being conducted at these sites. The IRB is primarily charged with protecting the subjects participating on the trial to make sure that the trials are run in a very safe and ethical manner. They have to approve the protocol version of the trial before it's allowed to begin. And again, any special or serious adverse events or side effects that are seen need to be reported to the IRB within a specific time frame, especially if more serious. The IRB has the ability to halt or stop accrual or adding new patients to a trial at any time, or to even stop treatment from happening if there is a serious safety concern. The IRB can stop the accrual of the trial at one site only if there's concern that it's not being run appropriately at one site, or it can stop the accrual or the treatment itself at all sites if there's a safety concern. And then certainly the FDA can be involved at any time, and they can conduct an audit of the trial or a trial site at any time during the trial. Each new drug or treatment approach to become widely accepted by medical experts and of course approved by the FDA to be commercially available, it has to be tested in clinical trials and go through a series of steps called phases. Typically, cancer clinical trials are broken up into four different phases of treatment. In the early phases, researchers are really determining whether the treatment is safe and effective, and generally what the correct dose is to be given. In later phases, they might be evaluating the treatment to compare it with an already approved standard of care treatment, and the like. So in a phase 1 clinical trial, researchers are generally trying to determine the maximum tolerated dose, or the most safe and effective dose that can be given with therapeutic benefit to patients without causing serious side effects. Sometimes in a phase 1 trial, this is the first time that a drug's been given or tested in humans. So in some rare cases, you will even see a phase 1 trial or a first in human trial. However, there are a lot of phase 1 trials that are testing already approved drugs that are maybe already approved for a different indication or a different disease. But because we're testing it in a different indication or a different population, we still need to go back to the very beginning and start it at a phase 1 trial. We then, for phase 1 trials, we might see only 20 or so patients, maybe at just a handful of clinical sites that we're testing this particular study. Once we get through phase 1, we can move to a phase 2 trial. Phase 2 trials are going to be tested in more patients, maybe 100 to a couple of hundred patients. We might see it expand to more sites, maybe 20 or so sites throughout the country. And we're looking, again, always at safety, but also looking more at effectiveness. And we're looking a lot at side effect profiles of those drugs at that point, kind of because we have bigger numbers, deciding what percentage of patients get a specific side effects and really tracking that kind information in more detail because there are more patients to look at. Next, we could move to a phase 3 trial. Again, always looking at effectiveness and safety with side effects. But in a phase 3 trial, a lot of times we're looking at a comparison trial with other treatments. So, for example, if we're looking at a new trial or a new combination of drugs for a specific disease, we might, in a phase 3 trial, compare that to the already approved regimen given to those same patients. So we might see, in this case, a randomized trial where some patients are getting the already approved drugs and some patients are getting the new regimen, and really comparing the safety, side effect profile, efficacy. As I mentioned earlier, quality of life could be looked at in a phase 3 trial as well, kind of looking at which is easier for patients to tolerate, that kind of thing. And then finally, phase 4 trial is generally something that happens after market. So after the FDA has already approved the drug and it's on the market and available, some drugs will go through a phase 4 trial. And this is nice. We look at different indications and some different information there with thousands and thousands of patients. There is not a requirement for a phase 4 trial prior to FDA approval. So it's generally not. Oncology, we don't always see those types of things as well. So some key statistics about clinical trials. Sadly, although 40 to 50% of all clinical trials studied in the US are focused on cancer, very few adult cancer patients actually enroll in a clinical trial. Only looking at maybe 5 to 8%, depending on which survey you look at, of cancer patients actually enroll in a clinical trial. And of course, these numbers are for all cancer patients, not called out specifically just for blood cancers, which is a small percentage of cancers altogether. Interestingly, close to half of all patients that are children or pediatric patients actually enroll and participate in clinical trials. And the interesting thing there, and really people feel that the reason for that is that children with cancer are generally treated at academic centers or research centers where there's quite a prevalence of clinical trials, where a lot of adult patients are treated out in the community settings with less access to clinical trials. Interestingly, about a fifth of cancer clinical trials fail or are closed to insufficient enrollment. So they don't even get enough patients to have a legitimate trial or experiment going. And so they just end up closing, which is really sad. So there's a lot of unchecked research going on out there that can't even get to fruition because there just isn't the population needed to explore those any further. About 27% of cancer patients have the option to enroll at a clinical trial at their local center. So again, because a lot of adult patients are treated out in the community or smaller sites, they don't really have options for clinical trials at those particular settings. And finally, the clinical trial landscape is so complicated, everything I've just talked about and I'm going to continue to talk about, it can be very overwhelming and hard to navigate. And so patients don't even pursue a trial. So certainly one of the most important things when considering a clinical trial are, like any treatment, there are risks and benefits of participating in a clinical trial and clinical trial treatments, just as there are for any sort of treatment that you're considering. Some of the benefits to think about is the notion certainly that you're contributing to science. You're helping future patients with your same disease, in some cases a rare disease where there isn't a lot of information about it, that you would be contributing to science and really helping future generations with that particular condition. Patients are able to get early access to new therapies without waiting those sometimes years and years for these drugs to get approved by the FDA and available for doctors to be able to just prescribe. So there is some early access excitement there, and that can be perceived as a benefit. Certainly the drug that's being studied, the experimental drug, is offered to patients at no cost. The study sponsor generally takes care of that cost for the experimental drug. We're going to go into a lot more detail here about the financial considerations a little bit later, but the drug that is being studied is generally free. When you go on a clinical trial, you're generally accessing physicians that have extensive experience with your particular disease. And sometimes that's a rare disease. You're really getting the attention of physicians who that is their primary focus, and that's what they've been studying. So you have some good experience there. And then another benefit to think about is that when you're on trial, you are really followed very, very closely and kind of have another level of care. Now, that is not to say that if you don't go on a clinical trial that you're not going to get good care. Certainly that is not the case, I hope, for any of you out there that are dealing with treatment. But when you go on a clinical trial, you definitely have access to another level of care called your study team. So not only are you getting treatment and being followed, of course, by your primary physician, maybe there's a nurse practitioner or mid-level practitioner there that you see quite often or talk to. You have your clinic nurses and maybe infusion nurses and nursing assistants that you talk to and that you're seen by when you go to the clinic. But when you're on a clinical trial, you also have a study team. Usually that's a clinical research nurse and or a clinical research coordinator. And that's really just another person that you're going to be communicating with fairly often when you have side effects, when you need to get in to be seen. And of course, the reason for this is the oversight of a clinical trial. There's quite a bit, again, as I mentioned earlier, with the FDA and the IRB, there are specific time points and data that needs to be managed very carefully and very timely when a site is conducting a clinical trial. So you have these extra people kind of on the team that are really keeping an eye on things and are another point of contact for you. Certainly, there are risks to participating in a clinical trial. Again, just as there are risks for any treatment, there's always the possibility that the treatment may not work. And, you know, if any of you have been on different types of treatments and clinical trials, you know that that is definitely a fear and a true case in a lot of cases. There is an unknown or fear of side effects. As I mentioned, before a clinical trial is designed, there should be expected side effects, things that we expect to see depending on how the drug works. Does it work in the gastrointestinal system? So we might have that GI upset. So we are going to expect nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, that kind of thing. But with a clinical trial, because it has been tested generally in fewer people, there is always the risk that there could be a new side effect or something more severe that we weren't expecting. For randomized trials, kind of what I mentioned there, sometimes with phase 3 and beyond trials, there could be a few different study arms that you're going to get into, testing a couple of different regimens, such as standard of care, what's already approved, versus a new regimen, or sometimes we might see a few different drugs being tested, some standard of care drugs, different variety of drugs with a new regimen. And so there is a risk of maybe getting on an arm that of treatment that you would prefer to be on a different one. So when you go on a randomized trial, that's kind of, so we don't always know what the drugs are that you're going to be getting per se. And again, I'll go into that into a little more detail here shortly. And then another risk or negative, I guess you could say, would be on a clinical trial, there is a lot more scrutiny. And so a lot of times there are more required lab visits, doctor visits, those kinds of things that will certainly increase a patient's time away from their home, from their work, from their family. And so, you know, a risk of having to arrange for maybe childcare, pet care, that kind of thing. So it is certainly something to consider. So why do patients enroll in clinical trials there? I've just given you some very good positives and negatives. A recent survey updated last year of over 3,600 patients who participated in a clinical trial. However, what we've found, even with these results, is that over the last decade or so, the reasons stay fairly static, that patients kind of say the same things generally year to year. The altruistic motivators, such as advancing science and treatment of this disease or condition and helping others who suffer from that disease, tend to top the list always. And we see this more in older patients over 45, versus patients that are a little bit younger. Although interestingly, patients over 45 or a little bit older patients are also most likely to say that they participate because they want to obtain better treatment for their own disease or condition. So kind of both helping others as well as helping myself. But you can see that, the big percentages there on why people participate are to help others. Interestingly, that monetary compensation, people do feel that there is some sort of compensation there. And again, I'll go into a little more detail about that shortly here. But in North America, we see a little higher percentage of patients that say that they're looking for monetary compensation for participation. Patients do certainly want to learn more about and improve their health, or they heard from a friend or a doctor, or that kind of thing as to why they're participating. So myths. This is an important one, and these myths are certainly important to dispel, but also things that we hear out there in social media and just kind of word of mouth. And so I think this is, if I can send home any take home information today, this would probably be the one that I would really like to make sure that people understand. That there are a lot of myths, and most of them are not true. The first one that we hear a lot from patients is that I can only join a clinical trial if I've exhausted all other options. Isn't a clinical trial a last-ditch effort when I've failed all of the other regimens out there? And that is really not true. There are clinical trials available for patients throughout the disease process. We see clinical trials all the time for patients who are newly diagnosed with a disease and have not received any treatment yet. Certainly there are clinical trials out there for patients who have relapsed or refractory disease, meaning that their disease either isn't responding to the current regimen, or it did respond, but now it has come back. Sometimes those relapsed or refractory clinical trials are built for patients that have only maybe had one prior treatment. Some of them you might have had to have 2 or 3. Very clearly laid out in the protocol, as I mentioned before. There's also trials out there for patients who are in remission and looking for a maintenance drug, something that's going to keep them in remission. So those are maintenance type of or consolidation trials. So there's lots of different types of trials out there, certainly not for patients that have just exhausted all their options. Next myth we hear a lot are clinical trials are not safe and I will not benefit from them. The process, as I mentioned, starts in the lab and it's regulated really highly by the FDA and an IRB within the US. And so there's really a ton of scrutiny on safety and to make sure that patients are treated ethically and safely on trial. I might get a placebo or sugar pill instead of the real drug if I join a clinical trial. So it's not as though that there aren't clinical trials, including a placebo for cancer clinical trials. However, it would be unethical for a clinical trial to be built for patients with active disease and then give them only a placebo that doesn't treat their active cancer. So in general, in the oncology world, you will not see a trial that compares an active treatment with no treatment at all, meaning a placebo. The only time we really do see placebos in clinical trials for cancer patients is that sometimes we might be looking at, let's say, a combination therapy, something that's already approved by the FDA to use in that particular disease. And we want to add, let's say, another drug to it, an experimental drug. We might see a randomized trial where half of the patients are getting the already approved combination of therapy, and then the other half of the patients might be getting that same already approved therapy plus that additional experimental drug. So half the patients would be getting the placebo on top, half the patients would be getting the experimental drug on top. So all patients are getting something that we know works for their disease, but we're trying to decide if adding that extra drug makes a difference. So that's kind of the only time we really see placebos mentioned in oncology clinical trials. And most importantly, the regulations out there do require patients to know if the trial contains a placebo and what your chances of getting that particular arm with the placebo are. And as I mentioned again, they're just not given in cancer clinical trials. Lastly, the one that we hear a lot too is that clinical trials are free. I wish that were the case. I wish that I could tell you that if you go on clinical trial, everything is paid for, all of your care is paid for, but that is just not the case. The drug that's being studied is provided by the sponsor. And so that is a big benefit for patients if you don't have insurance, or for the insurance to not have to pay for that. Generally is the most expensive part of treatment sometimes is the drug. However, the patient or the patient's insurance is still responsible for the standard of care treatment. So for instance, your lab visits that you would have, regardless if you were on any treatment at all, you're still going to be going in for lab assessments and clinic visits to see your physician to see how the treatment is working. So those are still billed to your insurance as a standard of care requirement. If you get sick while you're on treatment and have to be hospitalized, again, that's still billed to insurance. If there are anything that's specifically for research that is not a standard of care, let's say they want an extra lab draw this week because of the trial, but normally that wouldn't be required on a standard of care treatment, then those types of things are picked up by the sponsor of the study. But generally, there is definitely still some billing that goes on to insurance. So finding a trial. A lot of the reason that patients don't go on trial is because it is, as I mentioned, a really tough landscape to navigate. And there are a lot of barriers to going on trial. For the patients, their health insurance and other financial constraints, maybe you don't have insurance, or your health insurance is a managed plan like an HMO, and it requires that you are only seen within a small network of providers. And the clinical trials out there are being run at a clinical site that your insurance doesn't cover. That's certainly a barrier for participation. The location of trial sites. You might live in a smaller rural setting, and your closest major cancer center is an 8 or 10 hour drive away. If you are looking at a clinical trial that requires that you go in for weekly visits, that could be a big barrier for you. So that certainly is a barrier for a lot of patients to be able to just get to the sites where the trial is being offered. Certainly there's a lack of awareness of opportunities. Patients don't realize that there are trials out there. Again, looking at some of those myths, they might just assume that, I haven't had lots of therapy, so I'm not eligible for a trial, and that's not always the case. And then again, complexity and access and stringency of the trial participation that I mentioned, those eligibility criteria, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, those certainly can be a barrier for some patients, maybe with pre-existing conditions or other health issues, might not be able to participate on certain trials because it just isn't safe to give them those particular drugs in a clinical setting, a clinical trial setting. Not only are there patient barriers, but there are physician barriers. Physicians, a lot of community oncologists are spending, 8 or 9 hours a day seeing patients back to back. They don't have the ability to do the research to really know what other trials or what trials are being offered out there for patients. And so they just have a lack of awareness of the opportunities that are available. They don't have the time, again, seeing back-to-back patients to really research the trials for, all diseases at a smaller community setting. You might have a doctor who's seeing lots of different patients with lots of different cancers. And there just really isn't the time to go through and figure out what specifically is out there for their one patient with Waldenstrom's. Some physicians, I've heard reports of this. I don't have any actual experience with this, but there is the thought that they could be losing their patient to another center, and that's definitely not the case. It is true that sometimes you do have to leave your home oncologist to participate in a trial at a cancer center that's maybe nearby. But a trial is only a short time, a short treatment, and definitely that home oncologist is going to be involved in that patient's care even during trial. They're really kept in the loop of what's going on, and if there's local lab work and those types of things that need to be done while on trial, having that home oncologist as just another part of the care team during trial is really important. And then certainly there are some healthcare teams that just don't have as much of an understanding about clinical trials if they're not at one of the bigger research academic centers where there's a lot of trials going on and being offered. I mentioned earlier that the fun topic of finances and clinical trials not being free. And so I wanted to kind of go into that a little bit more because it is kind of a murky area. And I don't want to go into a great deal of time talking about insurance because honestly, that could just be a whole webinar on its own. It's so confusing here in the US when we talk about insurance. But I did want to at least give you this basic slide on what is paid for by who in kind of big buckets when associated with clinical trials. So as I mentioned, the sponsor does cover the cost of treatment and treatment administration for the experimental drug. Sometimes you will see a trial that is combining an experimental drug with a standard of care drug. And in that case, the standard of care drug is still going to be charged to the insurance, but that experimental piece of the drug is definitely paid for by the sponsor. Some sponsors will also pay for some travel and lodging. They are not required to do that. And so those are, we'll go into questions to ask and at the end here, and we'll go through that in more detail. But sometimes travel and lodging or a stipend is provided to patients participating, but this is study specific. As I mentioned, if there's extra tests, interventions, extra office visits that are required by the trial that are not generally a standard of care, then those could be picked up by the sponsor. Your insurance carrier is still going to be billed for standard of care tests and treatments. If there are complications, supportive care medicines needed, that kind of thing. Some insurance carriers, depending on the policy that you have, does have caveats about phase 1 trials. And so those are good things to talk to a case manager at your insurance company if they deny a clinical trial as to why. And then again, as I mentioned, like with HMO insurance and those types of managed care plans, sometimes you do need to stay within a network or within a state, such as Medicaid, that kind of thing. You usually need to stay within your state for treatment. So then the rest is really for the patient, financial considerations to think about your copays, your deductibles, out-of-network costs if you're going to be getting treatment in an out-of-network facility, your travel, lodging for yourself and maybe someone who's coming with you to care for you, food while you're traveling, if you need to take time off work, if you need to arrange for childcare, elder care, pet boarding, that kind of thing. Those are all things to consider when you're considering really any treatment, but especially with a clinical trial because there could be more time away involved. So where do you look? I'm ready to think about a clinical trial. Where do I look for such a thing? Your healthcare provider, certainly this, we encourage patients from day one of diagnosis to constantly be talking, having that conversation with your doctor. Is a clinical trial something that we should be thinking about? So opening that communication early and often. We certainly, if you're being seen at a larger academic center or a big cancer institute, a lot of them will have the clinical trials that they offer right on their website. So that's a place to look. Patient organizations, cancer.org, there are cancer support community, Lazarex. There are some different patient organizations that offer matching type services or databases that you can look for clinical trials. There are government databases. ClinicalTrialsgov is the largest database of clinical trials worldwide. It's a web-based resource that provides access and information on publicly and privately supported clinical trials. So every trial run in the US is going to be on clinicaltrials.gov. And there's also, if the trial is being run in different countries, it's also going to be noted there. But I'll go through that in a little bit. But that's generally the most comprehensive resource out there, clinicaltrials.gov. Cancer.gov, also by the NCI or National Cancer Institute, is going to give you NCI supported clinical trials. And then there are certainly industry and for-profit companies, depending the different pharmaceutical companies, like I have Celgene listed here, that run big clinical trials for cancer patients. A lot of times their sites will tell you about the sites or the clinical trials that are being offered by their company. So you can take a look at that if you're interested in a particular drug that you've read about. That's a place to look. I have mentioned here, Genentech, that kind of thing. So a little more about ClinicalTrialsgov, since that is the most comprehensive database of trials. Generally, whenever a trial is opened, it has to be listed here on ClinicalTrials.gov. It's the most comprehensive, and it's required for all investigators to list their trials here. It's not just for cancer trials. You're going to see trials here for just about anything being studied, even those that don't require drugs or treatments that are offered for healthy volunteers and that kind of thing. So it's certainly not just for cancer. It is maintained by the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health. So it is a government site. The information there is provided and updated by the sponsor or principal investigator of the study. And the site allows you to filter your search by your disease, the location, age, type of treatment, and there's a lot of specific ways that you can filter the information. But the site is not super easy to use. But you should take a look at that and kind of browse around. When you search for trials, you can look at a few different types of graphics. For example, I'm just showing you here that you could look at a map graphic to see the trials in this fashion, using a map kind of showing all the different trials for whatever indication you're looking for available in each particular state. Keep in mind that the database also would have those trials that are available in Canada, Asia, Europe. So if you're unable to travel or only want to travel a short distance, you can actually filter your search by a state, by your city, let's say within 100 miles of a city, that kind of a thing. So you can really filter it down to make it a better filter for yourself. Once you put in all your filter information, the results come back in a table form like this. They're going to show you the title of the study, the phase of the study that I mentioned earlier, and the locations it's being conducted. If you click on the title of the trial, it actually brings you to that specific trial page, which gives you a very lengthy study description, the agents that are being investigated, that eligibility criteria that I've talked about a few times, looking at exclusion and inclusion, so you can get an idea if your particular scenario might make you eligible for that particular study. And again, a list of the trial sites with the contact information. Sometimes it'll give you some very general contact information. Sometimes it will actually give you the trial site contact information, like the doctor's information and all of that too. Just depends on how the sponsor wants to list it. So the bottom line is that the information is out there, but it is really hard to navigate. It's a ton of information to kind of wade through. The information on clinicaltrials.gov is in summary format. And sometimes the descriptions and information about the eligibility is really limited, doesn't give you the entire picture. The language sometimes also in clinicaltrials.gov is very scientific and can make things kind of confusing if you're newly diagnosed and all of this is very new to you. Trying to figure out if you're really a candidate for this particular trial. It can be really exasperating and make you feel really isolated when you feel like you're having to do all of this legwork for yourself or for someone that you care about that's dealing with a diagnosis. So how can we help? The Leukemia and Lymphoma Society put together about almost 5 years ago the Clinical Trials Support Center, really just to help patients with this whole process. We are a group of 9 nurses and nurse navigators. All of us have experience in clinical research or oncology experience with, and specifically with the hematological malignancies or blood cancers. So all of us have come from that background, whether it be clinical nurses working or nurse practitioners working with blood cancer specifically, or research nurses working with clinical trials for blood cancer specifically. And how can we help you? So we help you really with this matching process. This little diagram here is really showing you that there's maybe a ton of open trials for a specific indication, but when you start looking at the specific data for the patient, such as their age, their diagnosis, where they live geographically or where they want to travel to, the stage of their cancer, their mutations, their genetic mutations play a role. the prior lines of therapy that they may or may not have had, their other health history, their performance status, meaning how active are they? Are they able to walk unassisted? Are they able to take care of themselves? And again, like I mentioned, geography, are they willing to travel? What kind of therapy are they looking for? You might be looking only for a drug that you can take as a pill. You don't want to go to an infusion center, those kinds of things. When we put all that kind of in our funnel, we find that maybe there's only 1 or 2 trials that would actually work for that particular patient. The LLS is really committed to providing resources to help patients access clinical trials. So again, that's why we put this group together. We're highly trained nurses. We specialize in blood cancer and clinical research. We provide education to patients and their family members about clinical trials. Basically, a lot of what I'm going through today is what we'd be talking to patients about on the phone. The treatment options, their disease-specific information. We have lots of great resources that we can give to patients to do further reading and researching on their own as well. And then working with patients or caregivers, we give them a detailed individualized search to discuss with their provider. We provide the guidance and serve as advocates through the clinical trial process. We can help the patients or family members make those connections between the patient and the trial site to facilitate enrollment. So we don't just give you a list and say, here you go, we're finished. We want to continue to help you. If it turns out that there's a trial that we've been able to isolate for you that you and your physician are really interested in, we can then, on your behalf, talk to the trial site and say, find out a little bit more about the trial, about your specific eligibility for the trial. Are there currently slots available on the trial? Sometimes that's an issue, and really kind of help you connect with the right people at that site. And we really want to develop a long-term relationship. We're not a call center. We don't just take a quick call and then when you call back, you talk to somebody else. We take our patients or family members on a case-by-case management basis. So once your case has been assigned to one of the nurses, that's your contact at LLS for the clinical trial search, and we will continue to work with you for months or even years in some cases, helping patients go on multiple trials if that's the right thing for them. So how to connect with us. We have at LLS an Information Resource Center, or IRC, and there's an 800 number that you can call and speak to an IRC specialist, which are master's trained social workers and nurses that field questions. That is a call center. They field questions about disease information, financial resources, basic social work support. And if it's something that after speaking with you, you feel that a clinical trial is something that you're interested in, they can help you make that online referral that will come to us, and we can start our process of clinical intake with you. And once we get that referral, we contact you within a day to 2 days. Usually it's the same day if possible, to begin the initial clinical intake process. We have nurses that work all over the country in all the different time zones. So depending on where you are, sometimes like if it's a West Coast referral, we might have a nurse on the West Coast that might call you because it's later in the day, that kind of a thing. And what to expect during the call. So once we get that case and we start working on it, we're going to call you and talk a little bit more about the reasons that you're seeking treatment or that your family member feels that a clinical trial is something to consider. We're going to talk a lot about what I have gone through already today. Talk about the barriers that you might have to encounter for enrolling on a trial. We want to learn more about the patient, their prior treatments, how they've responded to those treatments, their current physical condition, their past medical history, what other comorbidities or other medical concerns are they battling and take medication for that might affect their eligibility for a particular trial. That's important, super important to know. And then we, again, want to help them understand the process, including your rights, your obligations as a clinical trial participant, go through phases, that kind of thing with the patients or family members. After we speak initially, we're gonna, if it's appropriate, we're gonna conduct a clinical trial search based on what we talked about. And then within a day or two of talking to you, then we should be able to put together a search for you that then we can go over in a little more detail with you and help guide you through that. And again, we really will always encourage you to discuss any trial results that we find with your healthcare team to make sure that this is the right thing for you, to help you decide if a trial is right and which one. And then, as I mentioned, if it is the right thing to go for a trial, we can certainly help you reach out to those clinical sites to make those connections and see if that particular trial is the right thing for you. So you've identified a clinical trial. Now what? Really the first thing that you're going to be presented with when you are looking at a trial would be an informed consent document, which can be a very, very lengthy, sometimes 40, 50 pages long document that the treating physician is going to go over with you. And that you have to, go through and make sure that you're informed of all of the details of the trial before you're able to enroll. When you have that appointment to really talk about the trial and look at an informed consent, we really encourage you to bring an advocate. The information that you're going to be receiving is overwhelming. Having someone with you as a second pair of ears to listen to everything that's being discussed is super helpful. In the current times with COVID, sometimes it's just not possible to have someone with you for these appointments because they just don't allow a family member in with you. And so having someone on speakerphone or FaceTime is certainly, I would say, encouraged to do that during an appointment so that you can have that advocate with you, even if they're not physically in the room with you. And certainly, even if you sign an informed consent form and something you're considering and you decide a few days later that that's not something you want to participate in, you can always just, decline, and you always have the right to decline a clinical trial. So special considerations. So when you go on a clinical trial, you have certain rights as a participant. Any volunteer who gives their consent to participate in a trial needs to be told the purpose of the trial, to be told all the risks or side effects that they might be expected to have, to be told of any benefits that can be reasonably expected, to be told what will happen in the study and whether any procedures or drugs or devices are different than those used in standard treatment. You should be told about the options available to you, and if they have more risks or benefits than a clinical trial. So, what are my options? Do I have a standard of care option that I should consider instead of this? You should be allowed to ask any questions before giving your consent and any time during the course of the study. You should be allowed ample time without pressure to decide whether to consent or not to consent to participate. If you're not comfortable because it's a short appointment, you should definitely ask for a copy of that informed consent to take home and read page by page at home before deciding to sign that consent form. You might have a family member who's a doctor or something that you'd like to run that by before signing consent. So definitely ask for that ample time to be able to do that. You should be told of any medical treatments available if complications occur during the trial. And then once you sign, assuming you want to sign and to participate on the trial, you need to make sure that you receive a signed and dated copy of that consent form that you've signed by yourself and by the doctor. And again, you should know that you have the ability to refuse to participate for any reason before or after the trial starts. Some things to think about asking the doctor during that appointment. What's being studied? Why do researchers believe the intervention being studied might be effective? Why might it not be effective? Has it been tested before? What are the possible interventions that I might receive during this trial? Is there a randomized process to this particular trial? How will it be determined which interventions I will receive? Will it be by chance? And who will know which interventions I receive? Will I know? Is it a blinded study? Will the members of the research team know what I'm receiving? How are the possible risks or side effects and benefits of this trial? How do they compare with those of my current treatment? What do I have to do? What are the requirements? How often will I need to be at the hospital or clinic? What tests and procedures are involved? How often will I be here for lab work, scans, bone marrow biopsies, office visits, those types of things? How long will the study last? Is it a short, 1-year study, 6-month study? Or sometimes there are studies that are available that you can stay on if the drug is working for you indefinitely. So those are good questions to ask. And then finally, who's going to pay for my participation? Again, asking those questions about if I have to travel far to get to this site, is there any reimbursement for those travel and lodging expenses? Those are good questions to ask. Will I be reimbursed again for other expenses? Is there long-term follow-up? Some studies require that you're seen annually for 15 years per se. So it's good to always ask those types of questions. If I'm benefiting from this treatment, will I be allowed to continue receiving it if the trial ends? That's a great question to ask. What about the results of the trial? Will I be told about them? Will they be provided to me? And who's part of my study team? Who will I talk to? Who will I call when I have side effects? Those types of things. And what are my options if I'm injured in the study? Some closing thoughts. So the Clinical Trial Support Center at the LLS, our job is really not to enroll every patient into a trial. We are not pushing clinical trials. We're simply educating on clinical trials. We want to increase the opportunities for participation by facilitating informed decision-making and helping to ease those logistical barriers that patients encounter when they're looking at clinical trials. We work in collaboration with the healthcare team. We're certainly not trying to go around your primary hematologist who's really the one that's on the front lines working with you. We're just trying to add information to help you all make the best informed decision. We really educate, support, and empower patients to be active participants in and have control over their treatment decisions. Instead of just being told what to do, we want you to have that information so that you can have those bigger conversations with your healthcare team. Again, how to access us, there's this 1-800-955-4572 phone number. Call the IRC. They can help you fill out this referral form if you'd like to have information about clinical trials for yourself or a family member. Or there's also, if you go to our website, lls.org/navigation, you can fill out the referral form on your own without having to go through the IRC, and it will come directly to us. Here are some other free LLS resources. LLS.org is a great site that offers lots of different podcasts, publications, support groups, peer-to-peer support. A patient community is kind of an online chat. There's nutrition consultations, all kinds of different things to take a look at. So this is a great resource for you as well, beyond just clinical trial support. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of your day. I hope that I was able to offer some good information and food for thought as you're considering some different treatment options for yourself or for your loved one. I think we're going to have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Neena, for a most comprehensive and clear presentation. It sounds like your Clinical Trial Support Center is an invaluable resource for patients and caregivers exploring the clinical trial option. Now, we've had a few questions submitted in advance by our participants, and I will now ask the expert and Neena will respond. So first one, Neena, I'm concerned that if I were on a clinical trial for a cancer such as Waldenstrom's, I might be given a placebo, which would have no effect. In cancer trials, are some of the subjects given placebos to see what happens if the cancer is untreated?
No, it's a great question. And as I kind of mentioned earlier in the presentation, it would really be unethical to give a patient with an active cancer a placebo drug only. If you're entering a treatment trial with active disease, you're always going to be given something that we know works for your disease. The only time you see a placebo is when it's given in combination with an active treatment. And that's generally reserved for those phase 3 trials, but you're never going to have a placebo only arm with an active disease.
Thank you. What's the best phase of a clinical trial to look for in order to ensure that I get a drug that I want?
Generally speaking, phase 1 and most of phase 2 trial patients are going to receive the drug under investigation, and those are the single arm type studies. Those randomized or comparison trials are usually done in phase 3 where you have a percentage chance of getting one drug or another. But that said, the study that you're going to be enrolling into should be very clear about your chances of getting on one arm of the trial or another. So you're fully aware of your chances up front. that's really one of in the Bill of Rights for patients participating on trial, to know what their chances are of getting the drug.
Great, thank you. With the COVID pandemic, I don't want to get on a plane and travel. How are trials coping with that? Are trials more likely than they used to be to accept patients without requiring them to travel to the site?
That's a great question, and the answer is really continually changing. We are definitely hearing about more sites and more trial sponsors that are really working with patients to make participation on trial easier, given the pandemic restrictions. The FDA has also provided some guidance here in the US on providing some leniency to sponsors in regards to these same issues. And overall, the most important thing to remember is that the most important aspect of a trial is to make sure that trials are being conducted safely and ethically. So overall, it's still going to be the most important thing to think about. There may definitely be some flexibility with trials where some of their required visits can be done via telehealth. Possibly lab draws and other testing that's usually done at the trial site could be performed closer to the patient's home to help avoid with that extra travel. But overall, it's going to be really dependent on the trial itself, the site and the sponsor working closely together to make sure that they're conducting the trial safely while trying to help those patients. So questions certainly that you're going to want to ask when you're maybe meeting with a doctor for a consult about a trial, even if that's over video, is, can the visits be done remotely? Can I sign the informed consent electronically, not in person? How often would I need to physically travel to the site, or can I have things done at my local oncology clinic? Those types of questions would be good to ask.
Great. Okay. When is it appropriate to consider a clinical trial rather than standard treatment?
Great question. We always encourage patients to start that discussion about clinical trials at diagnosis. So from the time of diagnosis, really asking your doctor, what about trials? What about trials? As I mentioned, there are trials available for patients at all stages of treatment, from initial treatment to treatment for relapse disease and even maintenance. So it's always available.
Okay. Next question. I'm still on watch and wait, but my numbers are getting to where I'm going to need treatment soon. How do I know when is the appropriate time to try to apply for a trial and get started?
So again, your healthcare provider or your primary hematologist is going to be the best person to guide you here. There are a lot of factors that are looked at when determining when to initiate treatment. And these guidelines are really driven from years of research. So your doctor should be watching those lab values, other signs and symptoms to guide you to when you're going to need to initiate treatment. And then, of course, at that point, it's really, that's at the point when you will want to discuss clinical trials when you're ready to discuss or to start initiating treatment.
Thank you. How many attempts does it typically take to place a patient in a clinical trial?
That's an interesting question. And again, it really, trial participation is really going to depend on lots of factors, mostly centered around that eligibility criteria I mentioned, inclusion and exclusion criteria. But, if you're eligible for a trial and the trial is openly accruing patients and there aren't any geography or insurance restrictions that would be a barrier, then you should be able to enroll in the trial. It's not really a matter of attempts if it's the right trial for you.
Patients have any access to American clinical trials?
Well, traveling to the US for care can certainly be difficult, even more difficult right now in the time of COVID. Citizens of other countries are planning to travel to the US for cancer treatment, generally need to obtain a non-immigrant visa for medical treatment from the US Embassy or consulate in their home country. And again, with COVID, this is making this even more difficult now. Additionally, it's super difficult to come to the US for treatment without any kind of US insurance, unless you're willing and able to pay out of pocket for the treatment. As I mentioned, even trials, though the drug study is generally covered by the sponsor, those standard of care visits, such as your doctor visits and labs and scans and bone marrow biopsies, those types of things are still the patient's responsibility or the US or insurance responsibility. So if you're going to come to the US for treatment, or consideration of clinical trials, we do suggest that you find an NCI or National Cancer Institute designated cancer center and schedule a consult. And a lot of these larger centers do have international departments that help international patients coming to the US for treatment.
Thank you. Can the LLS program help Waldenstrom patients find appropriate clinical trials in other countries, such as Ireland? Does LLS have offices in countries other than the US?
At this time, the LLS and the Clinical Trial Support Center are only able to help blood cancer patients and their caregivers here in the US and Canada to help potentially find clinical trials in these two countries and overcome those barriers. ClinicalTrialsgov, the site that I referred to in my presentation earlier, does show trial sites outside of the US. So that's a tool that patients could use to search for trials outside of these two countries. LLS does have an affiliate in Canada, but not any other countries outside of the US. A couple of organizations that help international patients, and we refer patients to these organizations sometimes when we get these inquiries from international patients outside of the US and Canada. The MAX Foundation is based here in the US, but it's dedicated to improving the lives and survival rates of patients living with blood cancer and rare cancers worldwide. And the other organization is the UICC Global Cancer Control, which is uicc.org. And that's another organization existing to help the global health community in the fight against cancer.
Okay. Are there WM clinical trials for holistic practices or alternative medicines or even prevention trials?
You know, there's always new trials, new research going on all the time. Things change really daily, weekly. I am not personally aware of any specific trials for Waldenstrom's using holistic or alternative medications or specifically for prevention. But if that's something that's of interest to you, you can always contact us here at the Clinical Trial Support Center, and we can certainly perform a search at that time and see if anything comes up. Okay.
And last question, my wife has lung cancer. Does LLS help patients with non-blood cancers find clinical trials?
No, I'm sorry. LLS is really only, we only assist blood cancer patients and caregivers. Our clinical trial service is really just limited to blood cancers.
Thanks again to Neena Kennedy for her participation in today's program and for answering all our questions. We'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the sponsors for today's webinar: the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, Vigene, Selectar Biosciences, Janssen Pharmacyclics, Treadway Foundation, and X4 Pharmaceuticals. The IWMF is extremely grateful to all of you in the audience for being part of today's program and hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you missed the 2020 IWMF Virtual Ed Forum or any of the other global educational webinars, they are available on demand at IWMF.com. Remember to check the IWMF events website calendar or watch your inbox for e-news on upcoming global educational webinars. Thank you.